So, welcome everyone to this evening's celebration of the Liturgy of the Day. My name is Osho Brad, and I'm one of the priests at the Dragonfly Sangha. Let us share the peace. May all beings awaken to that peace which is our true home. Let us take refuge. I take refuge in the ground of being, within which I live and move and breathe. Let us make the accord. I take sanctuary in the heart of being, accepting all of my delusions in thought, word, or deed, born of ignorance, hatred, and greed. Let us give thanks. I give thanks for all beings, awakening to the interbeing of all nature. May my heart be open and my mind clear. May all be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, and may all come to know that peace which is beyond all understanding. Since it is the practice of enlightenment, that practice has no beginning. And since it is enlightenment within the practice, that realization has no end. So I wanted to take some time this evening to talk about some common misconceptions about Buddhism. Because over the last few decades in the U.S. in particular, Buddhism has entered popular culture. And those of us who are Buddhist are generally thrilled about that exposure, because we've found these practices to be very helpful to enhance our lives, and we want others to benefit in a similar way. But like anything in popular culture, Buddhism can be misinterpreted. Oftentimes because it's consumed in small doses from various sources. And that can lead to some misinterpretation or misunderstanding. And so I wanted to spend some time really over the next 2 weeks talking about some of those misrepresentations and share my perspective as a Buddhist priest. And I know that, and I'll talk about this in my Dharma talk today. There are a lot of perspectives on Buddhism, right? So these are mine. So I will say that. So if you disagree or have other thoughts, please leave a comment on the video or reach out to us. Would love to hear from you. So one of the first misconceptions, or sometimes what folks get wrong about Buddhism, and this is one that I've heard from friends of mine, is they believe that the Dalai Lama, who is one of the most visible public figures in Buddhism, is sort of like a Buddhist pope, the leader of all Buddhists. And I understand why people would think that. The Dalai Lama is very prominent among Buddhist leaders, very popular Buddhist author. I even have some books on my shelf by the Dalai Lama. Also has some connections to celebrities in Hollywood, and so he's been visible in that space. And also, too, the Free Tibet movement being very widespread, and the Dalai Lama being the sort of the leader of Tibet, before the Chinese takeover. There's a great movie about that, Kundun, that was about the Dalai Lama and his story. But the Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, is the 14th Dalai Lama, leader of the Tibetan school of Buddhism, also known as the Vajrayana school. And that was kind of the next misconception that I wanted to address, is that, that's just one school of Buddhism. The Dalai Lama sort of being the figurehead of that Tibetan Buddhism, or that Vajrayana school, as we call it. And while Buddhists do tend to believe the same thing kind of at a high level, the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, there are a lot of different schools of Buddhism and a lot of different sects in Buddhism. And you see this in other religions as well, right? You know, within Christianity, some of the larger divisions we see, I don't want to call them divisions, you know, but the larger schools that we see within Christianity are, you know, Catholic and Protestant. Within both of those, you have your own sort of schools and you know, different groups. So within the Protestant tradition, you have denominations such as Methodist and Lutheran, Presbyterian, Adventists, so on and so forth. Judaism, same thing. You know, you typically see Judaism talked about in three divisions, you know, Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative. Islam, Sunni, and Shia. And within Buddhism, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about Buddhism really being broken into three traditions. The Vajrayana that I mentioned, which is largely the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, which is Buddhism, and when it moved into Tibet, it took on a lot of the Tibetan cultural marks, which is, you know, very common when a religion sort of enters a new area. Two other, you know, large groups in Buddhism is the Theravada and the Mahayana. You may hear those words used as well. Theravada, at very high level generalization. Theravada tends to be a bit more what folks, you know, the traditional view of Buddhists. Very popular in Southeast Asia and India. And the Mahayana schools, you know, both of these are very widespread. Mahayana schools you see more in China, Japan, and in the US as well. And each of those groups have a lot of different schools, right? Different practices, different looks and feels, different liturgies. You know, I have a few, you know, books of liturgy alongside our book of common meditation, and a lot of the liturgies, the language is the same, but there's some differences. You know, all sorts of interesting expressions of Buddhism, even down to robe color. You know, what you may see. We tend to wear black or white robes, sometimes gray robes. The Dalai Lama, you'll often see him and other Tibetan monks wearing a maroon robe, you know, maroon and yellow. Monks in the Southeast Asia, a lot of Theravadan schools, you'll see wearing the saffron robe, which is sort of like an orange-yellow color. A lot of Zen priests will wear black robes. Thich Nhat Hanh, another Zen priest, a very popular teacher who passed away earlier this year, his order out of Vietnam wore brown robes. So, my point being, lots of different Buddhisms, you could almost say, and there's no one sort of figurehead that you see, say, in Christianity and Catholicism with the Pope. So, because Buddhism has been and continues to be, and probably will continue to be, as the years go on, expressed in a variety of ways. And I think that's personally very lovely, because there's always more to learn from each other. So, another misconception about Buddhism, and again, I think this comes from comparisons to other traditions. The Buddha is not a god. And again, this is another one that I think, especially in the West, is sort of easy to understand why people may think that the Buddha is a god. You know, because in the West, where a lot of us grow up understanding religion in the context of the church, you know, we think like, oh, you believe in God, right? And a lot of times you think, well, if you don't believe in God, you're not religious. And that's sort of that dichotomy that we have a lot of times. So people think, well, if you're religious, if you're, you know, even if you're Buddhist, you must believe in a God. And is Buddha the God? Like, named after him, right? Is he the God? You know, we can even see that from other world religions, right? You know, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, there's all sort of one God, these monotheistic traditions, or many gods. You know, people are like, oh, hey, you know, Hinduism, they have a pantheon, right? They have several gods, right? Wicca, Santeria, things like that. And there are also, quite frankly, gods in Buddhism, though the Buddha himself is not a god. And the gods in Buddhism show up in a lot of stories. And because, a lot of people worshipped a lot of different gods in the time of the Buddha, and since, of course. And as I mentioned, it's not uncommon when a religion moves into a new area and is spread, that some of that is incorporated into the tradition. And so some of those gods sort of entered into um, Buddhist tradition and Buddhist religion. Um, but in my experience as a Buddhist priest, the gods within Buddhism are less prominent than in other religions, and even some people will never talk about those gods in their practice. And quite frankly, a lot of times in the stories, the Buddha is teaching the Dharma to the gods, right? Which is a little different than what we see in some other traditions where, the main teacher might be teaching the truth of the gods, right? Here, the Buddha has found sort of that ultimate truth and is teaching it to the gods so they can learn, so they can go beyond their divinity, and really seek awakening. As for the Buddha himself, not a god, he was a man named Siddhartha Gautama. Um, born to parents, had a half sister, had grandparents, uncles, things like that, was married, had children. We know the names of all these folks, right? The Buddha, just like all of us will, grew old, became sick, and he died. And so we don't worship the Buddha as a god. We venerate the Buddha as a teacher who taught us how to live more fully and awaken to the truth of oneness that he discovered and chose to share. Another misconception that I sometimes encounter related to Buddhism is that people think that Buddhism is all about suffering, right? And I know I've spoken before about a piece of, I think, classic Chinese art. I think it's called something like the Three Sages or something like that, where it has essentially Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu from Taoism, and Confucius. They're all drinking, tea that represents life, right? And to Confucius, the tea is very, very bitter, and to the Buddha, the tea is very sour. And maybe I'm mixing those two up. And then to Lao Tzu, the tea is very sweet, right? And the lesson being there, like, oh, look at these other Chinese teachings of Confucianism and Buddhism, like they're so, and Taoism is a very happy one. And obviously I've not found that to be the case in my practice, that Buddhism, even though, there are teachings about suffering, it is not a bitter or a sour practice. It's actually a very happy practice, and it enlivens one's life. And a lot of the focus on suffering as a Buddhist teaching comes because of one of the first Buddhist teachings. When the Buddha gave his first sermon at Deer Park, after he experienced awakening, he taught about the Four Noble Truths. He taught about, saying like, hey, there's suffering, dukkha, right? And I tend to prefer the translation of unsatisfactoriness, that sense of, there's this great illusion that dukkha essentially means a wheel that isn't turning correctly, right? You're driving, you're like, I think there's something wrong with my back tire. Something feels off. Unsatisfactoriness, right? That's what dukkha is. And then, of course, the second noble truth of tanha, or suffering, is caused by craving and clinging. Nirodha, the third noble truth, saying that, hey, this suffering can end. And the fourth one, magga, being there's a path. And the path being the Eightfold Path, which is broken up into practices around ethics and wisdom and concentration. But those sort of fundamental early Buddhist teachings, people kind of cling on to those and say, well, that's it, right? Like, that's what Buddha teaches. First thing Buddha says, boy, life is suffering. Everything is suffering, right? But To focus on suffering is to miss the point of Buddhism, right? Saying all life is suffering, everything is suffering, is kind of missing the point. Because the Buddha started with suffering because he was being sort of a spiritual doctor, saying, hey, you're experiencing a symptom, aren't you? And I'm going to call that symptom dukkha. You feel like something isn't quite right. You feel unhappy. You're struggling. You're suffering. Why is that? Well, I think I know why. And I think I know what you can do. And instead of just reducing the symptoms, of suffering, I'm going to give you a treatment. I'm going to treat the cause of that. And let's really dive into that. And that work is Buddhism. The suffering isn't Buddhism. No more than sin. The concept of sin in Christianity is the focus of Christianity, right? Now, certainly I'm sure there are Buddhists who are very focused on suffering, just as there are Christians who are very focused on sin, right? And, yelling at people to stop sinning, right? And people might be very focused on like, oh, suffering, I need to end suffering. And the ego is like, ego makes me suffering, so I need to get rid of the ego, which is a spoiler for the next thing that I'm going to talk about, the next misconception. But again, if you within the church, if you're focused on sin, you're missing that redemptive and compassionate message of Jesus. Same thing as focusing on suffering in Buddhism. You're going to miss a lot of the other teachings. Because suffering is a symptom of clinging to an illusion of separation. And the work is to, dissipate that illusion and see what's true, what's actually true, capital T, true, right? So I hinted at the next misconception about Buddhism. And this is something, the first three are ones that sometimes people from the outside, when they're looking in at Buddhism, and as I go through my list of some of these misconceptions, you'll kind of see I'm moving from the outside and moving more in. So now, something that folks, when they are a beginner in Buddhism, they first encounter Buddhism, they read some of the teachings, they see some of the teachings around suffering, and ooh, there seems to be some problem with the ego self, right? Or the self in general. Oh wait, what's this about the no self doctrine, right? They hear it, referred to and things like that, and then they start to think that the goal of Buddhism is to destroy the ego self. And this is not true. And I know that we've talked about this in a variety of other talks. I know that Sensei Tony spoke about this recently as well. But again, it's not uncommon for beginners to kind of fixate on the ego self as the cause of suffering. So, want to eliminate suffering? Let's eliminate the ego self, right? It's a thing I'm clinging to, so clearly I got to get rid of it, right? Especially when you pair it with notions of, nirvana and enlightenment and the definitions of the ego, that incorporate concepts of impermanence, emptiness, shunyata, right? It's easy to think that Buddhism is about destroying the ego, and that's our whole goal. And that can lead to an unfortunate sense of nihilism, which is just not, shouldn't be a part of your Buddhist practice. Because here's the thing: not only is it impossible to get rid of the ego self, it's really dangerous to try to do that. The reality, the full picture of yourself, can be seen kind of through two lenses. The relative versus the absolute, the subjective versus the objective, the ego self and the true self, right? It's two sides of one coin, or as we often will teach, it's like two wings on a bird, right? A bird can't fly with one wing, neither can you live your life only with the ego or only with the true self for your Buddha nature. You need both views, right? And we've discussed in previous talks the notion of spiritual bypassing. It's a concept coined by John Wellwood, a psychotherapist, and that's where we focus only on these spiritual matters. We focus only on the true self or on Buddha nature, and we're like, bleh, ego self, yuck, get rid of it, right? And what that does is, we we make progress against these spiritual pursuits, or we seem to make progress against these spiritual pursuits with everything that we're doing, but we're neglecting our ego. We're focused on the absolute, and we leave the relative to stagnate. And so we become, in the very real world, where our ego selves live, we're stuck in our old habits, our destructive habits. We're neglecting ourselves. We're damaging relationships. We're hurting people around us, right? Because we think we're focused on higher truths, so we can just leave all this mundane stuff behind, right? But this isn't where we should focus. The ego self is where the work gets done, right? This is really where the rewards of practice are reaped. The goal is to allow your absolute true self, your Buddha nature, to manifest through the relative ego self, right? The true self to become evident in the ego self, not to destroy the ego, right? Because then, without the ego self, the true self loses a unique and novel and compelling way to be experienced by other people in the world, to be experienced by you in the world. The ego self is how we learn about the true self. We apply our knowledge and, to gain wisdom in our conventional reality. You can think of the ego self almost as a textbook for all this stuff written just for you, right? All of your experiences. It's a very unique expression of the true self. So don't throw out that textbook. Do the work in that textbook. Don't destroy the ego. You can't. You shouldn't. This shouldn't be your goal. I get a little passionate about that one. And the last misconception that I wanted to speak about this evening. A lot of folks, when they think about Buddhism and they're starting to study, they get attached to this notion of enlightenment, of nirvana. And they think once you're enlightened, you're all set. Right? It's a popular notion. I know we've spoken about it in previous talks as well, that when a Buddhist is awakened, they have this sudden aha moment, right? And suddenly life is blissful, always happy, unbothered. Maybe there's some superpowers involved. I know I talked about that, the concept of awakening in Kung Fu Panda, right? Superpowers. Or Neo from the Matrix. A lot of these popular notions of, someone who figures it out, quote unquote, is suddenly unbothered all the time, emotionless, if not always happy. And, can bend space and time and fly and things like that. And here's the thing, there certainly can be sudden realizations of truth in your practice as a Buddhist. Light bulbs come on, you see things differently. I've certainly had moments like that where after studying, that makes sense now. Okay, I heard it a different way. Or maybe I was more ready to hear something. You kind of tilled the soil. Now the seed has a place to sink in and get watered and actually grow, right? But those aha moments usually happen after a period of study and reflection. And so it tends to be, while there can be sort of upticks, it tends to be more of a gradual awakening. And here's the thing, even after those mountaintop experiences, and I know there are analogs to mountaintop experiences and other spiritual traditions, you come down from that moment, right? There might be a moment in time or a place, a certain book you're reading, a certain teaching that you're listening to, or maybe it's in a koan practice, and the light bulb comes on. But then you go back to the real world. And there's a book, and it just came to mind, so I don't have the title of it, but it's something like After the Ecstasy, the Laundry, or something like that. It's a book written, I believe, by a Buddhist teacher. But this notion of like, yeah, after that big realization, you have to go on living, right? And this kind of is attached to this notion of, you can't destroy the ego self because the ego self is still there. The ego self still has to go to work tomorrow. So what do you do, right? Why bother practicing if I'm not going to hit this mountaintop where I can just be happy all the time and have superpowers and things like that? Why practice if I'm still going to have a bad day at work? I'm going to eat some bad takeout and get a stomach ache. Or someone I love is going to be diagnosed with a terrible illness, and that's going to hurt me. Like, why can't I always be blissed out? Those things will throw you off. But the difference, after a period of awakening, is those things will still throw you off. But you will be more prepared to deal with the emotions that arise. Those very human, ego self emotions that arise because of the people in our lives we care about, because of the things that we value. Like anger and sadness and other emotions that sometimes trip us up. But now I'm angry turns into, there's anger. I recognize that. I don't have to associate or identify with that anger, but there's anger there, because of the things that I love and the things that I value. Or, oh, that jerk, becomes, I understand that I'd probably act the same way in that position. Right? Or I can't be sick, becomes, I know that everything is impermanent, including my health, including this illness. Right? Now, those reactions, those transformations around the emotions that pop up that may sound very kind of emotionless and bland and vanilla, and you may think, well, why would I want to do that? Right? But we can still be very full of emotion and live life to the fullest, even after waking up. But hopefully, we're less prone to be swept away by those emotions. And a lot of times, the emotions that sweep us away are emotions that aren't always very healthy, and the ones we often cling to and we really get hooked by, right? And hopefully, the process of waking up will help keep us from acting in a way that we'll regret, because the emotions we feel lead to actions that we take that cause harm, that cause regret, that hurt others, that hurt ourselves, and thereby we're reducing suffering in the world, right? So we find that walking that path, doing the work with the ego self, well, we acknowledge that suffering, we're reducing it, we're not fixated on that suffering, and that's the benefit and work of enlightenment, of awakening. It's not being set, being unbothered for all time, being unmoved and emotionless. It just means being able to encounter and live more nobly in the midst of those things that maybe a year ago, maybe 6 months ago or 6 years ago, really threw us off and made us pretty unhappy. So I'm going to pause here. And next week I want to talk a bit more about some of the other misconceptions around Buddhism. Again, dealing with some more of the beliefs. Maybe for folks who are more, have been studying maybe some things that from the outside people look at and they think like, oh, Buddhists are all about this thing, like karma and rebirth. We'll talk about some of those things too. But hopefully this was a helpful overview of some of those misconceptions. Maybe these are things that you've heard yourself. Maybe these are things that you've believed yourself. Maybe you still believe them. And that's okay. But I always feel like it's worthwhile putting, a deeper perspective into the world. So I hope that this has been helpful. The moment we receive true and trusting, solid and clear like a diamond, infinite light and life embrace and protect us, liberating us completely. Let us take the 4 immeasurable vows. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them. Delusions are endless. I vow to end them. The ways of compassion and wisdom are boundless. I vow to embody them. The way is unattainable. I vow to attain it. Let us take the precepts for the community of the vow. I allow my true self to manifest in all aspects of life. I take complete responsibility for my own life and all of my actions. I affirm my personal being and acknowledge it as a path to awakening and freedom. I embrace all aspects of my personal being, including my shadow, so that they may be transformed. I affirm an attitude of openness to my true self, even in the midst of suffering. So what I would like to do now is we will spend some time chanting the Nembutsu. And as always, I have my handy fish drum, my Mokugyo, that I will strike. We'll chant through maybe 3 times. And as we chant the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu, I would invite you to offer incense at your home altar, at your home centering space. And then after we chant for a time and offer incense, we'll spend some time in quiet reflection and meditation and abiding. And I will start that time with a bell, and I'll ring the bell at the end of that time, and then we'll close. also to acknowledge the fact that when we celebrate these liturgies and come together, that we do so with all those who have practiced before, who are practicing now, and who will practice in the future. Let us recite the Bodhisattva's Gatha. We dedicate this practice to the welfare of all beings throughout space and time. May it always be so. So I hope that you have found this time and these words helpful. And if maybe you've been curious about Buddhism in the past, maybe you have been studying and want to deepen your practice, maybe you would like to, study to become a teacher, to become a priest, and be ordained in our order. If so, I would encourage you to reach out, get in touch with us. You can do so by visiting AskSenseiTony.com or DragonflySangha.com. And I hope that you all have a wonderful week. Thank you.